Welcome to the Creator's Crypt. My name is Russ Adams. I was a special effects artist for over 25 years. I created creatures and props for films, television, and even commercials. I wrote 6 how-to books on special effects projects, and I starred on a reality show where we had to build creature suits and animatronic puppets in 2 to 3 days. So artistically speaking, I feel like I have a lot of experience to share. But enough of that. Let's get into this art stuff. This week I'd like to talk about art education. Is art school an important factor in your overall success as an artist? As someone with a master's in literature, I feel that extending your education is extremely important. I mean, it couldn't hurt. And yeah, I do complain about its viability from time to time, but I do completely support those who seek out education. But that education isn't always going to be useful in your 9 to 5. If you've been watching the podcast for a few months, you've pretty much come to the conclusion or heard me say that I'm a special effects artist and that I have been a special effects artist for almost 30 years. I make things like costumes, props, animatronics, things like that. But I never went to school for it. And you might be thinking, are there schools out there? Are there specialty schools out there that teach special effects? And yes, there are. As a matter of fact, there are way more options for education in that arena than when I was coming up in the 80s. I say this a lot, but as I was coming up back then, I was trying to gather as much information as I could about the subject, and I was always just really disappointed in the availability of data. It was an interesting yet daunting process because there was no internet. There was no Google to search for processes. There was no Amazon to find the perfect book on the subject. And there certainly wasn't a YouTube where you could find the best tutorials. So what was there? There were magazines that would have an occasional photo of a creature in progress that you could then glean the how-to from that grainy photo. There was also a lot of trial and error. When you figured out where you could get the materials, which was daunting in itself, then you had to figure out how to use them properly. And with no tutorials and no how-tos, you were basically left to your own devices to figure out what worked and what didn't and why it didn't. I had the opportunity to go to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh right out of high school. There weren't a whole lot of opportunities for special effects, but this was one of them. And I was lucky to have it. It was about 2 hours away from my hometown, which was within reach, but it was still problematic. Then there was the problem of my family. See, when I was a kid talking about becoming a special effects artist, it was cute and, things like that. But the older I got and the more serious I became, the more they began to freak out that I was going to pursue a career in television and film. I'll spare you the details, but some of the things like my grandfather told me were that artists were broken people and they were destitute. He basically told me that I was going to die penniless if I continued on this path, and suggested that I either join the military or become an accountant. It scared me enough that I passed up that opportunity to go to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, and I joined the military. When I was younger, in my school years, I would tinker and mess around with things and try to learn as much as I could. In the military, I had way less time to myself, but I still tried to further that education the best that I could. I really didn't want to give up my dream of working in film. So my education became more of a self-taught method, which I feel was more beneficial to me in my overall career as a special effects person. Setting aside the fact that my 10 years in the military severely stunted my opportunities in the field. Later in my life, I did pursue a degree in secondary education, getting my bachelor's and my master's, as we talked about. So I'm familiar with both the formal education and the self-taught method. Having my foot in the door of both worlds, I think, has helped strengthen my opinion of both the pros and cons of either one of those two methods. So I guess let's get into the meat of it. What's the difference between going to school for special effects and being self-taught? I can tell you that I've spent tens of thousands of dollars in the pursuit of my self-taught education in special effects. And we've already talked about that, but I would have spent tens of thousands of dollars anyway if I went to, a formal education process. And in that way, they're both the same. So if they cost the same, what's the difference? Based on my experience, I feel like there are 3 core differences between traditional and self-taught education. I think those 3 core differences are space, pace, and technique. In a traditional education, you're going to learn it on their timetable. So there's a fixed pace, and they're not going to slow down to make sure that you got the concepts. That's basically all on you. You learn it or you fall behind. Bring in a tutor, find another option to help you learn those concepts, but it's all on you to catch up. The professor basically has a schedule to keep, and come hell or high water, they're going to keep that schedule, student be damned. If you go the self-taught route, it's going to take you longer to get the education, but that's okay. It's all about how you retain the information and the concepts. It's not about how fast you got there. A professor might fly through something like sculpting strategies, but on your own, you're going to tinker with that until you get it right. And because you're doing it that way, you're going to learn why those steps are important, why those strategies are important. And I bet you jump from the blocking stage to fine detail just once before you realize how much it sucks to have to obliterate hours worth of work because something didn't work out because you jumped ahead in the process. So the pros of self-pacing mean that you get there on your schedule. The drawbacks are you the type of person that can keep at it until you do get it? Do you understand the concept that you are not going to get it the first or second time out? That failure is probable. You're not going to mold, sculpt, and cast like a professional right out the gate. And you need to understand that. Basically, you need the self-discipline to know that your first sculpture isn't going to be pretty. It's likely to be something akin to a mush man. I remember when I started doing this professionally, I went back and destroyed all of my molds from my learning process. I didn't want anyone to ever see the crap that I had created before I became a professional. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do that, but the difference between what I can do now and what I did then are literally night and day. And maybe there's a little bit of ego there that makes me want to at least appear as if I just popped out of the womb able to sculpt the way I sculpt now. So let's talk about the pros of space. So in a traditional secondary education program, you're basically going to learn in their environment. This does mean that you have to modify your travel plans and your schedule to get to that location for that education. And this is me lamenting a little bit, but after driving an hour or so out of your way, you then spend an hour trying to find a parking spot so that you can get to class without a ticket. Anyone who has ever attended a university realizes that in most cases, unless you buy one of those special passes, you're parking off campus somewhere and then walking all the way to that class. Because campus police are assholes and love to give tickets. Or you can learn in your environment, which likely means home. It's less structured, clearly, but it allows you to learn at the drop of a hat, pretty much in a space that's available to you night or day. So what if you wake up in the middle of the night and inspiration hits you and you want to get to it? You can do that. No parking issues, no tickets. You basically just get to work. Not to mention that while you get to work, you can just be binging episodes of your favorite show while you're in class. So what are the cons of working in your own space or space in general? The biggest problem with working in your own space is having that space. So while you're creating things in the practical effects realm, you're using materials that have noxious fumes and that, are basically toxic to others. And here's an example. If you have an apartment, you can't exactly use a spare bedroom to run fiberglass. Those fumes are going to drift through the air ducts into the apartments that neighbor you, and it's going to piss a lot of people off when they start getting sick. Even if you thought that opening a window to vent those fumes would be helpful, it's not. And that stuff permeates. So it will be in the walls. It's like living with a smoker, where it seems like that stink is in the carpet, it's in the walls, it's in the clothes, it's everywhere. So learning to use materials like this in that kind of space, it just isn't an option. Do you have the necessary equipment? Because in that secondary education program, they will have the necessary equipment that you can use. But if you're learning to run foam, you can't use your mixer from your kitchen, and you certainly cannot use your oven in your kitchen to run foam, because you will poison all the food that you make in that oven from that point on. And while those schools have that equipment available to you, they also have a means of evacuating those fumes on a more industrial level to make sure that you're safe. Let's start talking about the pros of technique. So when you're learning in a secondary education, you're basically learning their way, which might include information that you'll never use. You may have to learn several concepts and commit them to memory and then be tested on those concepts without having your notes. Because this is problematic, because in the real world of special effects, you don't necessarily want to have committed all this stuff to memory, because your memory can let you down. So just an aside, I've been building molds my entire career, and I couldn't exactly give you a number as to how many, whether they were hundreds or if they were thousands, but I know that I have always used my notes when I create a mold. Now, I know the ins and outs of mold making. I do have the concept committed to memory, but the one time that I threw caution to the wind and decided to create a mold without my notes, it was an epic fail. It was late one night, and I was working on this mold, and somehow in my mind, I managed to switch out Primarks with registrations, which basically meant when my mold was done, it couldn't hold fluid like liquid latex. So liquid latex is spilling all over the floor. And that's the last time that I failed to use my notes when I was creating a mold. And for the most part, if you do a lot of repetitious stuff, it's best to use your notes, because you get complacent and you start to forget, because of the arrogance of knowing that you know what you're doing, if that makes any sense. So you'll also be bombarded with a lot of personal bias. Certain professionals like things their way and not the other way. You're basically stuck learning that process from narrow-minded, stubborn individuals. So you're basically learning from their rehearsed lectures, from their overpriced books, and all of which in a way that they wish to present it. Here's an example. You want to learn more about effects makeup, and your thing is prosate transfers. That's what you want to learn. But the professor is hung up on foam latex and gelatin. So that's what you're going to learn. Or you can learn on your own. It's messy, it's wasteful, but they're all teaching moments. You're going to learn lots of ways to do things, and you're going to pick and choose what works best for you based upon the fact that you've tried them and you've used what you like and thrown out the rest. But you took the time to learn them, and you threw out what didn't work because you didn't like the results. So let's talk about the cons of techniques. Learning on your own isn't easy. Sometimes it is easier to have a set program in front of you because it's easier than weeding through everyone else's options and having to make a decision on what you want to ingest and assimilate. It can be wasteful and even expensive to learn that, say, options 3 through 19 just weren't helpful. So you can either pay someone to teach you at their pace, in their space, and using their techniques and style, or you can watch as many tutorials as possible, read a bunch of books, and buy materials that you know are expensive but are about to be sacrificed on the altar of education. But either way, whether it's traditional secondary education or self-taught, you're going to learn something. So I guess that's the other thing they have in common. Do you need a degree to be a special effects artist? And I'm going to go out on a limb and just say no. Most of the artists that either own or run a shop have been self-taught or they apprenticed. But I'm willing to bet that they didn't get a traditional secondary education specifically for that job. Most are going to look at your portfolio and they're going to see that you're competent. If they hear that you learned specifically by being self-taught, you might get a raised eyebrow that suggests that they're impressed, maybe. If they hear that you have a degree, are they going to be disappointed in the fact that you have a degree? Probably not. Either way, are they going to jump up with excitement? It's not likely. So does it matter which way you go? Does it matter whether you take the path of the traditional education or whether you're self-taught? Probably not. The most important thing is knowing your shit and being able to do the job that they set in front of you. And, be reliable. I mean, that's what really matters. I hope you enjoyed my opinion piece for this week's podcast. I think it's important for people to know that it's understandable and okay if getting a degree throws up a roadblock like scheduling issues and upfront cost. It's not detrimental to you getting into one of these career fields, at least from the perspective of someone who has been in the industry for 30 years and has worked on a number of Hollywood productions, indie productions, commercial productions, and even theater productions. From my experience, it's not that crucial. So don't let it stop you. There are other ways. I'd like to thank the guys over at the Collector's Maze Network. If you're looking for a single source of all things geek podcasts, this is your place. Go check out the Collector's Maze Network. They've got upwards of, I think by now they've got over 20 different podcasts ranging from Scooby-Doo fan-based podcasts to celebrity-based podcasts, Comic-Cons, everything. So go check them out. I would also like to thank my friend Gil Corzo for supplying me with the music for this podcast. So until next time, keep that creativity flowing.